So tonight we're going to talk about safer places, and a lot of the idea of safe zone or safer places comes out of LGBTQ, and so really it's an application of that to international spaces, intercultural spaces, and so I've also got three student here in the student panel who are in that inaugural course for Intercultural Competence, and so I will introduce them one at a time as they come up to present, because they're going to be presenting parts of this. But first, kind of what we're talking about, why Tucson? Tucson as a global destination. Talk a little bit about comprehensive internationalization, which is a concept that is within internationalization of higher education. Well, the students will define intercultural competence by defining the different parts: culture, intercultural or intercultural spaces, and then finally arriving at a definition of intercultural competence, which they've been studying this semester. And then I'll talk a little bit about intercultural competence at the University of Arizona and some of the different initiatives that we're engaged in here. So first, Tucson. I think nobody really thinks of Tucson as kind of this global destination, but we certainly do in our business. It is a globalized world, and so Tucson is there. We have many international companies. Caterpillar just moved into town, so there are a large number of companies that make it an international destination as well. We have military bases, and people don't think of military bases as places of internationalization, but they receive a lot of international officers and people from abroad as well. We've dealt with them. We've done teacher training for them, and we also, in the critical languages program, teach the Americans the different languages they need to know as they do their flyovers in the Middle East and so forth. We are not very far from the border. In fact, I actually was brought down to Tucson to oversee a program where we took teachers of English across the border into Mexico, and we would do that 2 nights a week. We no longer do that, but certainly that proximity allows us to have this privileged position, I think, in internationalization, as well as cross-border studies and a lot of the things that are going on as well. And it really, at the U of A, we really need to ask ourselves the question of what is the role of land-grant university in the 21st century. And land-grant universities were created back in the late 1800s as a solution to the different problems of local problems. But what problems are local anymore? It's pretty much a globalized set of problems that we have to deal with. So comprehensive internationalization of higher education is a concept of international education. It really is a commitment to confirm through action, if you read the red with me there, confirm through action to infuse international and comparative perspectives throughout the teaching, research, and service missions of higher education. It is an institutional imperative. Global reconfiguration of economies, systems of trade, research, and communication, and the impact of global forces on local life dramatically expand the need for comprehensive internationalization. And indeed, those are the different issues that are driving it, okay? So when we talk about comprehensive internationalization, we're really talking about student, faculty, and scholar mobility, both coming and going. These students here have just come back. 2 of them have just come back from study abroad. One is intending to go on study abroad. They are international students by the virtue of having been abroad or planning on going abroad. So that's one aspect of internationalization. Another aspect is research, especially internationally funded research. So different governments give money to study science, and then faculty get together across borders and study many different things, including the sciences. Okay, so there's a great degree of study that cross borders in constant. Another aspect of internationalization involves the curriculum. So how does the curriculum get internationalized? In the College of Humanities, we don't have a problem with internationalizing our curriculum because the nature of our curriculum is international. However, in the areas of physics, in the areas of engineering, how do you internationalize the curriculum? In the Office of Global Initiatives with the Study Abroad program, we're talking about how to infuse student learning outcomes which are international or global in focus across the campus. And so while that's really kind of still there, it's something that we certainly aspire to. And it's really part of what's considered comprehensive internationalization, is international of the curriculum across the curriculum. So all of that preparation, the preparation of the campus community to receive people, to send people, really needs to occur, okay? And that's driving the demand for campus intercultural competence at all levels. And when I say all levels, I mean not just students, graduate students, undergraduate students, but faculty and staff, and their skills and their ability as interculturally competent people to be able to speak to international people. It also then drives us to this theme of refuge, which we're talking about today, which is creating these safe havens for cultural and intercultural exploration, okay? And I don't think anyone really likes to call what we do in the humanities the soft skills, so I put it in quotes there, but the reality is that the soft skills are not science and math. They're really, the soft skills we talk about are those skills which are hard to measure. And so when we look at what we do in the humanities, we see, and when we look at higher education and the tendency of the future, it's to be more competency-based, okay? So a lot of higher education now in competition with online programs and justifying its existence in a lot of ways as bricks and mortar is, so what is that interaction that occurs in the classroom that you can't get away from? And so you look at competency-based education a lot, but you look at really what are those competencies? What are those critical competencies? Critical thinking is one of those competencies. How do you measure critical thinking? Very difficult, right? That's why it's considered a soft skill. Interpersonal skills that are developed by interpersonal relationships, interpersonal interactions that are not necessarily mediated by technology, but which are one-on-one, eye to eye, okay? And then within those soft skills, we also talk about intercultural competence. So these are really fundamental skills for a graduate to have success in a globalized, technologically advanced world. So when it comes to intercultural competence, for some of us, it might be a new concept, okay? So we're going to talk about it, and the students are going to talk about it. But when you look at intercultural competence, you see culture as being one of the key elements of it. So what is culture? What is the interculture piece? What is the intercultural space? What are we talking about when we talk about intercultural competence? Where does this occur? So we'll define intercultural competence, and then we'll define the skills of the interculturally competent person as well, okay? So that's the next step. But I'd like to talk a little bit about safe learning, because when I talk about learning in certainly my classroom, education really is a place where we're dispelling myths and getting rid of ignorance, right? It's a place where you can be ignorant, it seems to me. And teaching and learning is really a panacea. It solves a lot of problems. But really, so the idea of refuge is really creating these safe spaces for intercultural learning and training that must be harbored. They must be created. They must be purposely made, okay, by design. And so that's what we're really talking about, because mistakes will be made. So we need to have the ability to be in spaces where we can make these types of mistakes. The students here before you, first is Kaylee Wong, who's sitting right here. We've got Myles Shell in the middle, and Alyssa Martin, and they're going to present. And what I'll do is I'll introduce each of them before they come up. And so first and foremost, just to start, we'll start with Kaylee Wong, who's going to talk about culture. Get my glasses. I am of an age. All right. So Kaylee Wong is a senior here at the U of A. She's double majoring in global studies and communication with minors in Mandarin and marketing. She's a native English speaker who has also studied Korean, Mandarin, and Spanish. She recently returned from studying abroad at Seoul National University in South Korea for 6 months. After she graduates, she hopes to return to South Korea to be an English teacher before attending graduate school, studying international relations and specializing in the human rights violations occurring in North Korea. In her spare time, she enjoys swimming, photography, and practicing with her dance crew. So please welcome Kaylee.
Hello, everyone. As Nick said, my name is Kaylee, and so I'm just going to be talking a little bit about culture and explaining it, how it has always been taught to me and how it is also being taught in this course. So one of the biggest analogies of culture, it's one of the widest known ones, is to compare culture to an iceberg. So here we have an iceberg, and as you can see, it's kind of split into two parts. There's the part above the water and the part below water. So the part above the water is known as big C culture, which are things that you can see from far away, things that you can understand without being in the culture, such as food, music, historical artifacts, things like that. Things that you don't really need to have a huge understanding of the culture to see. And then the part below is known as little C culture, and as you can see, it's called little C culture, but it's actually a significantly larger portion of the iceberg. And so this part of culture is beliefs, values, morals, understanding of how we as people fit in with nature and the rest of society. And so these are things that you can't see from the surface, but are make up a very large part of culture. And then without an understanding of it, it's very hard to reach intercultural competence. So this is the biggest, most commonly used analogy for culture, but we also have a few others. So the top one is a fishbowl. So if you're a fish, you don't really realize that you're swimming in water. You're kind of just there. So that is an analogy for your own culture. You just accept it. It's just something that comes naturally to you. However, if you're on the other side of the fishbowl, you know that the fish is in water and I'm not in the water, and so it's kind of just you're together, but it's kind of separate. Like you won't be able to be in the water with the fish. And then the second one in the bottom left-hand corner is an onion. It's pretty self-explanatory. There's many layers to onions, so the deeper you cut, as Nick says, the deeper the layer, the more it stinks. So the deeper you go into the onion, the more you have an understanding, but the more controversial and more possibly contradictory it can be to your own culture. And then finally, the last one is glasses. Ironically, I didn't wear my glasses today, but basically, if you have your own pair of glasses, you don't really realize that you're wearing them. Everything looks normal. But if you put on a different pair of glasses, someone else's that might have a different prescription than yours, then everything's gonna look a little bit blurry, might give you a headache, be very out of place. So these are just some of the analogies that we use to describe culture. And so there's no one definitive definition of culture. Culture is constantly evolving, just as history and technology and everything else. And that's part of the definition of culture, is that it's constantly changing. So, and with that, everyone has their own definition of culture as well. So the first one is a definition by Rogers and Steinfeld. Is that correct? I hope that's correct. So it says culture is defined as the total way of life of a people, composed of their learned and shared behavioral patterns, values, norms, and material objects. Culture is a very general concept. Nevertheless, culture has very powerful effects on individual behavior, including communication behavior. So that one has a little bit more of a communication undertones for the definition of culture. And then the second one is by Gary Weaver, and it says culture is simply the way of life of a group of people passed down from one generation to the next through learning. Culture is not inherited, but instead learned unconsciously during our formative years, simply by growing up in a particular family. So that's a little bit more of a general understanding of culture. These are every definition is going to be slightly different. So from the readings that we've had and my experiences, I've actually created my own. A lot of the keywords in my definition come from Edward T. Hall, who is kind of known as the father of intercultural competence. So my definition as of now, who knows, it might change with tomorrow. Who knows? So mine is culture is a shared collection of beliefs, values, and patterned behaviors that are shaped by the communication and social interactions in an environment. So each one of those is very, like the bolded words are keywords that I think are very important to showing the depth and the way that culture can be understood, whether you're a native to that culture or whether you're someone learning it in second hand. So.
So the students really engage with culture, define it for themselves in a very inductive way, and especially because we have so many different cultures represented in the class, I think the class is probably 60% diverse at a minimum, I think so. So let's go to Myles Shell, who's going to talk about interculture. Myles Shell is from Bakersfield, California. He's a sophomore, and he's a humanities major. He's interested in film and television. He's an aspiring study abroad student, so he'll be studying abroad here pretty soon. He's also interested in film and photography as well as swimming in his spare time.
Hello, how is everyone? Very good. I'm going to be discussing interculture. And as I discuss interculture, basically culture is not something which is always easy to understand. And in order to explain that, we have culture A. And in culture A, there are different skills, attitudes, and knowledge that come within a culture that are each significant and different within their own. And in culture B, you have another culture which is completely different from culture A. And culture C has its own norms and values. But the thing about being in the very middle, which would be intercultural and cross culture, would be that that bridges the gap between cultures. And as I said, each one has its knowledge, its skills, and its attitudes. And basically, within being intercultural competent, you need to have safe conversations and being open to talk about them. And we can only become more interculturally competent if we are open to discussion about these things. And we need to have the right knowledge, skills, and attitudes to bridge these gaps. Another thing about all three of the cultures is that you have to be accepting to interculture in order to just get better at it, and that is the most important thing about intercultural. As we know, we have a lot of students at the University of Arizona that that are in between, like they're from other countries and they're coming here and they're learning about our culture at the U of A. And one of the most important things is gaining that knowledge in order to become interculturally competent and to basically become stronger in our beliefs. And then the definition of interculture and intercultural spaces, this is the space where more than two cultures come together, perhaps colliding, but where the skills of intercultural competence are most necessary. And as I said, the UA is one of those spaces. There are nearly 3,800 international students and nearly 800 visiting scholars. And I will be introducing Alyssa Martin. Yeah.
So if we go back just real quickly to this one, if you look at the space there, you know, some people grow up in this space as well, right? So this would be like a bicultural area where a lot of people in our class actually grew up in a cross culture. Another thing, based on the kind of the way that we talk about, if we use the analogy of icebergs, we could see that if these are three different icebergs coming together, that the greatest friction is right here, and so that's where we need the most competence as well. So let's move on to Alyssa. Alyssa Martin. Alyssa Martin is an honors senior studying global studies with an international political economic systems focused. She's studying also East Asian studies and linguistics. She has just returned from a year studying Korean at Seoul National University in South Korea and is working on her honors thesis on the use of English and English loanwords in the Korean cosmetics industry. After graduation, Alyssa plans to return to Seoul to complete her master's and eventually work in the U.S. Department of State as a foreign service officer.
First, I'm going to start out by giving a definition of intercultural competence. So this is the knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary to be effective and appropriate in intercultural spaces. So before going any further, I think it's important to define all of the key features of this definition. So, not actually in order, but first I'm going to talk about attitudes. So for attitudes, it is important to be curious and receptive to other cultures. And while attitude cannot be taught, having the right attitude will be the foundation and the support for all other aspects of intercultural competence. Next, for knowledge, it is important to have both culture-specific knowledge and also a deep understanding of culture as a whole, including context, roles, impact of culture on your own and others' worldviews. As for the skills, we will actually be going into greater detail on that in the next slide, especially because it's one of the main focuses of the College of Humanities. And so, as you can tell by the fact that they've been bolded and then also written on the side in the color red, being effective and appropriate are both very, very important aspects of intercultural competence. And so being effective means that you get the results that you want out of the interaction. Whatever your intentions were, you've accomplished them. And being appropriate means that the other person in this interaction or other people are satisfied with the interaction. So it's important to look at it not just as a personal experience. Whatever interaction is going to have at least one other person. It's important that both people are satisfied. Okay. So the important skill sets of intercultural competence and some of the important experiences that will go into intercultural competence are listed above. So first, interpersonal abilities in intercultural spaces. I have actually broken this down into two separate skills. The first is the ability to communicate effectively, which encompasses dealing with misunderstandings, as well as different styles of communication, applying your linguistic and paralinguistic knowledge, and using appropriate, respectful body language. Second is the ability to assess intercultural interactions. So being able to judge whether an interaction was successful or not and why, so as to address it for future interactions. This also includes self-monitoring, being aware of what you're doing, how it comes across, as well as acknowledging your own personal biases. Next is tolerance of ambiguity. So first would be flexibility. So even with prior study of a culture, interactions won't necessarily follow these typical cultural patterns. So it's important to be able to adapt, both during these interactions and in the future. Also is the ability to deal with psychological stress. Intercultural interactions are full of uncertainty, so mistakes will be made, interactions will go wrong, and there will be times when you are struggling. But it's important to push through and not let the stress build up. Now, the last two aspects of intercultural competence are closely related to each other, and while they are not skills, they inform the usage and development of the skills listed above. First would be self-confidence, which is an attitude in which you trust in your skills, no matter the circumstances or the stakes of the intercultural interaction. And this only comes from experience. Actually, speaking from experience, I can say that this last feature, experience with intercultural interactions, is going to be the most important. All of the studying in the world can't actually prepare you for successfully navigating intercultural interactions. It is only repetition of these interactions that can truly teach you these skills. Thank you.
So at the U of A, what are we really doing in terms of the different initiatives in terms of refuge and safe spaces and safer places for learning? One of those things what we talk about, and one of the things that's very recent is the Office of Diversity and Inclusive Excellence. So we talk about inclusive excellence because a lot of times people whose voices just aren't being heard need to be at the table. So that's a question of inclusive excellence, and there's a whole office now dedicated to that, which we didn't have before. Okay, and Jesus Trevino is in charge of that, and we're building. And so part of this falls in terms of cultural competency, falls in the area of his shop, and we work very carefully with them to be able to try to build capacity at the U of A in order to have more cultural competency training at the staff and faculty level as well. And some of that thing is coming as we speak. Also, I've proposed myself a Center for Research and Development of Intercultural Competence, which would consist of some undergraduate coursework, some graduate coursework in intercultural training, as well as develop, hopefully with some funding, some research as well to become the Southwest's kind of research and development arm for intercultural training, which isn't, it's something that's in demand at every university at a high scale. And we don't have the capacity right now to meet the demands that are necessary to be able to prepare faculty and staff for intercultural interactions. So we need more of these types of things. And then from there, it goes out into the community to do training with private companies who also need this type of training. So really, it's about creating a refuge for learning culture towards becoming interculturally competent. This is something that was relatively new to me a couple of years ago, but microaggressions are one of the things that we talk about in the course. We haven't really talked about it yet, but when we talk about microaggressions, this just came out this last couple of weeks from the Office of Diversity and Inclusive Excellence. And really, microaggressions are everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely on their marginalized group membership. And so we talk about international students, receiving international students, and the amount of slights that they receive from faculty and staff is pretty significant, okay? The minority students of the University of Arizona wrote a letter to the president earlier this year complaining about the campus climate. And so it's a very serious issue at the U of A that we need to address. And it's the humanities which is going to address this issue. I really strongly believe that we're on the front end of this, but we need to lead. But the complaints about microaggression are, well, you know, it's going to impinge on freedom of speech, or it may be considered a threat to someone. It's just one more of being politically correct. Okay, so my generation dealt with political correctness. I was raised on political correctness, or what we called political correctness, right? So much so that Seinfeld is based on political correctness, right? The whole system of South Park is based on political correctness, and certainly if you've ever watched Curb Your Enthusiasm, you know how not to act in society, right? But higher education really is a place where ideas, and this is another attitude, ideas must be expressed and may be offensive. Okay, so that's the freedom of speech argument. But is it really about freedom, or is it about respect? And that's my question. So in terms of safe learning environments, it's true. Words have consequences. Be prepared to accept what happens next. This is from a recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education talking about trigger warnings, microaggression, and this is actually a response to president of Chicago, University of Chicago, who talked about there will not be trigger warnings on this campus. But basically, words are dangerous, but not as dangerous as the efforts to suppress them. Okay, so that's a freedom of speech argument. But at the same time, the idea is that words have effect. The way you express yourself has an effect, and that is either respectful or not respectful. If we go back to the definition of microaggressions, we get into intentionality, right? So it's whether it's intentional or unintentional. If it's unintentional, it seems to me that this is a good place for you to learn that and then it becomes intentional. And then if it's intentional, then you should have to deal with consequences. And I'm hoping that this younger generation is going to stand up and hold people accountable for what it is they say. And so that's really what this course is really about, because we need more civil discourse and civil dialogue in our society today. And it comes out of respecting one another and engaging in that civil dialogue. And this is a quote from this last week, and it talks about humanity doesn't just exist, it has to be created over and over again. We're not born with an innate sympathy. The only way to build humanity is to show young people already rooted in their own birth culture that they can move beyond that culture without abandoning it, that what is foreign to that culture can remain foreign and still be worthy of thought and respect. Cultures which do not teach humanities, the humanities, are inviting serious trouble, for continuation of the current dystopia is not the worst possibility before us. This is from last week, Chronicle of Higher Education. Really, we look at that, and I look at that quote, and I see how powerful it is, because really we're at a turning point where we really need to make some decisions with regard to how we are able to converse and talk about how to become better intercultural learners, cultural learners, more respectful, okay? One of the things there, though, is and this would be the last slide, so we can transition into questions, but I brought this slide into the classroom, and one of the students pushed back on it, and guess what they pushed back on? Young people. Why young people? Why just the young people? And it was Alyssa, so I want Alyssa to, I have a question for Alyssa. What do you have to say about that, and why young people?
Thank you. So, while I would say that some of the skills necessary for intercultural competence, which is what this quote, oh, it's gone, which is what this quote is about, even though it doesn't use those words, some of the skills necessary do come with age. But I would say that it's something that not only the youth needs to work on, it's something that everyone needs to work on. And especially in some ways, I would say that the younger generation, having grown up in an increasingly globalized world, might already be more open towards these concepts and more open to expanding their horizons and looking beyond their own culture, which could be something that some older generations and some people of an older generation may have more issues with because they grew up in less of a globalized sort of situation. So I would say focusing just on younger people and saying how it's the young people who need to change isn't very fair.
So thank you.